it brings me so much joy, and it's such an honor to be here with Brit Bennett. Brit was born and raised in Southern California. She graduated from Stanford University and later earned her MFA in fiction at the University of Michigan, where she won a Hopwood Award in graduate short fiction, as well as a 2014 Hurston Wright Award for college writers. Her work is featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Paris Review, and Jezebel. She is one of the National Book Foundation's 2016 5 Under 35 honorees. The Vanishing Half was a #1 New York Times bestseller and Sunday Times bestseller in both hardback and paperback. Described as an utterly mesmerizing novel by Bernardine Evaristo, The Vanishing Half tells the story of estranged twin sisters who live very different lives, each with a different racial identity that soon unravels. Britt will be discussing the influences that helped shape the book and her own upbringing in Southern California. So, Britt, congratulations on such a stunning, touching, beautiful book. And also, I feel like I need to say thank you for such a stunning, touching, and beautiful book. It moved me to tears so many times, and it still gave me hope and joy and touched me in so many ways. And so I'm so looking forward to talking to you about it, of course, to hearing you read from it, to your answers and your questions, and to the audience answers and questions. So if we could please start off with a reading from you, that would be just such joy.
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Bookshop for having me. I'm going to read a little bit of a section from kind of halfway through the book. The novel follows these twin sisters, one who disappears, and this is a section of the book where we catch up with the disappeared sister and kind of see what she's been up to, which is that she's been trying to stop a Black family from moving into her white neighborhood. For what it's worth, Blake Sanders had been as surprised as anyone that his wife had spoken up in that meeting. She wasn't one for demonstrating. He'd never seen her riled up enough about any issue to do more than sign a petition. And even then, it was usually because she was too polite to shove a clipboard back into some college kid's face like he would have done. Sure, he wanted to keep the planet clean. He thought the war was rotten. But that didn't mean that screaming in the faces of decent, hardworking people was the right way to go about any of it. But Stella indulged these idealists, listened to their speeches, signed their petitions, all because she was too sweet to tell them to bug off. Yet here she was now, somehow, as fervent as any of these young protesters in the middle of the association meeting. He could have laughed, his shy Stella making a scene, although maybe he shouldn't have been surprised. A woman protecting her home came from a place more primal than politics. Besides, in all the time he'd known her, she'd never spoken kindly of a Negro. It embarrassed him a little, to tell the truth. He respected the natural order of things, but you didn't have to be cruel about it. As a boy, he'd had a colored nanny named Wilma, who was practically family. He still sent her a Christmas card each year. But Stella wouldn't even hire colored help for the house. She claimed Mexicans worked harder. He never understood why she averted her gaze when an old Negro woman shuffled past on the sidewalk, why she was always so curt with the elevator operators. She was jumpy around Negroes, like a child who'd been bit by a dog. That night, as they slipped out of the clubhouse, he smiled, offering his arm to her cheekily. It was a brisk April night. They passed slowly under the jacaranda trees, beginning to bloom lavender over their heads. I didn't know I'd married such a rabble-rouser, he said. He was a banker's son who'd left Boston to attend college, he'd told her when they first met. Although he didn't mention then that the bank at which his father was an executive was Chase National, and the college he'd left to attend, Yale. She would later realize that these were signs that he truly came from wealth, how rarely he wore expensive clothes, even though he could afford to, how little he talked about his father or his inheritance. He'd studied finance and marketing, and instead of heading to Madison Avenue, he'd followed his fiancée back to her hometown of New Orleans. The relationship fizzled, but by then he'd fallen in love with the city. That's how he ended up working in the marketing department at Maison Blanc, and that was why he was hiring her, Stella Vignez, as his new secretary. Even after 8 years of marriage, Stella still felt a little squeamish when people asked how they'd met. A boss, his secretary, a tale as old as time. It made you picture a greasy-haired potbelly in suspenders chasing a young girl around his desk. I wasn't some old lech, Blake had said once, laughing at a dinner party, and it was true. He was 28 then, hard-jawed, with ruffled blonde hair and bluish-gray eyes like Paul Newman. And maybe that was what made his attention different. Back then, she'd withered when a white man noticed her. Under Blake's gaze, she'd blossomed. Did I make a fool out of myself? She asked later. She was sitting in front of her vanity, brushing out her hair. Blake eased behind her, unbuttoning his white shirt. Of course not, he said. But it'll never happen, Stell. I don't know why everyone's getting all worked up. But you saw Percy up there. He looked plumb scared. Blake laughed. I love when you say things like that. Like what? Your country talk. Oh, don't make fun. Not right now. I'm not. I think it's cute. He stooped to kiss her cheek, and in the mirror, she watched his fair head bend over her dark one. Did she look as nervous as she felt? Would anybody be able to tell? A colored family in the neighborhood. Blake was right. It would never happen. The association would put a stop to it. They had lawyers on hand for such a thing, didn't they? What was the purpose of having an association if not to stop undesirables to move in? If not to ensure the neighborhood exists precisely as the neighbors wished? She tried to steady that flutter in her stomach, but she couldn't. She'd been caught before. Only once, the second time she'd ever pretended to be white. During her last summer in Mallard, weeks after venturing into the charm shop, she'd gone to the South Louisiana Museum of Art on an ordinary Saturday morning, not Negro Day, and walked right up to the main entrance, not the side door where Negroes lined up in the alley. Nobody stopped her, and again, she'd felt stupid for not trying this sooner. There was nothing to being white except for boldness. You could convince anyone you belonged somewhere if you acted like you did. In the museum, she glided slowly through the rooms, studying the fuzzy impressionists. She was listening distractedly as an elderly docent intoned to a circle of listless children when she noticed a Negro security guard in the corner of the room staring. Then he'd winked, and horrified, she rushed past him, head down, barely breathing until she stepped back into the bright morning. She rode the bus back to Mallard, her face burning. Of course, passing wasn't that easy. Of course, that colored guard recognized her. We always know our own, her mother said. And now a colored family moving across the street. Would they see her for what she was, or rather what she wasn't? Blake kissed the back of her neck, slipping his hand inside her robe. Don't worry about it, honey, he said. The association will never allow it. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. There's so many secrets just woven throughout the book. It's a stunning book. And so you've talked about sisters, identity, racism, colorism, violence, murder, home, gender, second chances, love, family, goodbyes. It's a sprawling novel that spans generations, locations, and topics. Where did the idea for the novel come from?
The book really started with my own mother, who is originally from rural Louisiana. And she was telling me one day about these towns that she remembered hearing about that were very obsessed with skin color. And I had never quite heard anything like that before. I grew up in California and also in a very different time. So the idea of there being a town like Mallard was something that kind of broke my brain a little bit, but also I was really fascinated about what it would be like to come from a Black town that is extremely color obsessed. And from there, I started to think about the idea of twin sisters coming from a place like that and each deciding to live their lives in very different directions.
You know, that does lead into my next question because the twins, they are, and you know, it's funny because when I first started writing my questions down, I would say the twins, and then realizing that they don't prefer that, I was like the girls, and then I'm going, they're characters, so but I still would change it to the girls. So like we talk about how characters grip and they just don't let go, and how they haunt us after the book is finished. And for me, I feel this way with Desiree and Stella, and also of course with Jude. You give this tenderness and vulnerability, you show this in their relationship. It's a bond where one sucks the blood from another's finger to soothe the cut. And then later, when Desiree's reflection appeared behind her, Stella looked away, ashamed almost to be seen wanting anything at all. Where Desiree can imitate Stella, but Stella cannot or does not imitate her sister, where one keeps secrets and the other cannot even imagine her sister having them. Can you talk a bit about how the sisters came to you and how you developed them? How did you get to know them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I really did get to know them over time, because I think for me, my biggest thing going into this was that I knew that a lot of stories about twins are either that the twins are kind of clones of each other, or they are just like complete opposites. Um, and I knew that I was striving for somewhere in between that. I knew that they would have some similarities because they share an upbringing, but at the same time, they are very different people. And some of those nuances in their relationship that you just alluded to, the fact that, Desiree, I think, thinks of herself. I mean, she is the like barely older one, but also I think thinks of herself in that role of the eldest, and all of that entails as far as being responsible for your sibling or being even protective of them. And also, I think, like you said, being presumptive. I think that Desiree has a lot of presumptions about her relationship with Stella, where she believes Stella to be as predictable as her own reflection and doesn't allow Stella to be a complex person who has her own really riveting inner life. And part of, I think, the major part of the kind of opening section of the book is Desiree coming to realize that her sister is her own person and has been, kept these secrets and has, and has been living this life that she did not really imagine her sister living. So I think for me, a lot of it was getting to know who these sisters are and getting to know what their relationship is like to each other, and also trying to imagine how each perceives that relationship differently. So how Desiree sees Stella versus how Stella sees Desiree, and how each of them see that bond. Because to me, so much of the energy was about the complexity of that sister relationship, which can be nurturing and supportive, but also claustrophobic and trapping for both of these women in different ways.
You know what it is? You've done such a lovely job of showing all of these complexities and the things that make them sisters, but also the things that make them unique and just these individual characters that we get to know and kind of accept. Even if you don't like what they do, I think that's the beautiful thing of the characters. They're so complex, and it seems you've given such care to it. So thank you so much for the experience of getting to know them, but also this place of Mallard, Louisiana. Can you talk to us a bit about? So this is a fictional place. It was founded by the girl's great grandfather, and the description of the setting. It's you do it with the characters as well, but it's just also here with the setting. It's vivid and evocative. So there's Lou, and I feel like I have to do the air quotes. So because I'm quoting, and I just feel like I don't want to misrepresent. Like I'm just coming off with these quotes like off the top of my head. So there's Lou pushing through the glass doors, chest heaving, neckline darkened with his own effort. Mallard is, according to the narrator, a strange place, a town that, like any other, was more idea than place. So I feel like every time you take us to a description, I can see and I can hear it, I can smell it, and it's just so wonderful. So I'm curious, how vividly do you see the town of Mallard, and how do you go about creating this sense of place for us, the reader?
Thank you. I think, yeah, for me, I think the town came from a few different sources. Part of it was based on the place where my mother actually did grow up, and, some of her experiences growing up in this farm town, which is, again, very different than my upbringing in the Southern California suburbs. So part of it was kind of drawing on some of the stories that she had told me about growing up on this farm town and what the experiences were like there. And I think the other part of it came from doing some historical research into some of these very small insular Creole communities and thinking about how they're sort of governed and how they operate, and how they create borders around themselves, like these invisible borders and these invisible hierarchies that people are kind of slotted into. Some of that came from actual research of reading about other towns that were these very color obsessed communities. So it was a mixture of both of those things. But I think, eventually I realized that I was interested in writing toward myth and memory as much as I was interested in writing towards history or sociology or anything like that. So I began to see the town as kind of a mythical place, a town that feels both real and unreal at the same time. And once I realized that, I was like, well, I'm just lean into it. I'm going to lean into it in the language. I'm going to lean into it through the narrator. I'm going to lean into the fact that this feels, that was the way that I received it when my mother was telling me about this town where, everyone in that town would just kind of marry each other so that their kids would get lighter and lighter. To me, that felt like something out of a myth. So when I went to write it, I decided to kind of lean in the way that that felt to me, and to lean into that kind of mythological feel for the story.
I love that. I love taking that curiosity and saying like, well, what can I do with it? But then also making it your own and like leaning into it. What other writing, what sort of research, what other research did you do in creating this book? And also what surprised you while you were writing it?
Well, as far as research goes, I did more research into the history of racial passing. So there are books that I read, historical books that I read on that were really interesting. One was A Chosen Exile by Allison Hobbs, which is a great book just on the history of racial passing. And so that was one thing. And there was more reading I did into the history of race in Louisiana and that very specific and unusual context in the context of American race, or race in America, I should say. It's there's like a very sort of particularity to Louisiana. So some of the reading I did was that. And then there were other different forms of research that I wanted to know about. There's a character book who's an actor, so I'm reading about like the psychology of acting. There's a character who's like kind of a bounty hunter, so I read a book by like someone who's a bounty hunter. So there were other just kind of random sort of alleyways I went down and reading about the book. I think as far as what was most surprising, I think just in every turn, kind of running up against the absurdities of race. I think that was the thing that became most surprising, and that's something I think is still to this day continues to surprise me, that you can be reading about something completely unrelated and here you go, you run up against it. I was looking up, this is a very big tangent, but I was looking up Linda Ellerby, the journalist, the other day, and I saw like on her Wikipedia page there was like a throwaway line about how when she like started off on radio or TV, they used her because she kind of sounded Black, and the Black person they had did not sound Black enough. So they used this white journalist who's from Texas because they wanted a Black sound and a voice, but they thought her voice sounded Blacker than the actual Black person that they had. And it was just like this total throwaway line in her Wikipedia page. But those are the types of things that I kept running against as I was writing this book. There were these moments of absurdity and also these moments of constantly running up against both the reality and also the fiction of race that I think that's embedded throughout our lives in different ways. But there were so many moments when I would run out against these things that almost felt like too heavy-handed for fiction, but these kind of aspects of race sort of revealing itself in ways that are unexpected, but being a constant as I was researching this book.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Can we talk a bit about, so the book is, a lot of it takes place in Mallard, and then New Orleans, California, with scenes across the US. They go to Boston. What are some of the influences on your writing in general? And on the Vanishing Half, I think in particular.
As far as, do you mean as far as geography or just in
Yeah,
general?
I think, well, gosh, both if you could. Geography, I think I was fascinated by the places that you took us in the book. And
Yeah.
then, of course, it was still your vivid description. So it was kind of like, okay, I've never been to that place, but you know what? Brit took me there. And so I got to see this and I got to smell this. And so, yeah, so I think for the geography, like how you chose, where you chose, and then also
Yeah.
just in general.
Yeah, I think for geography, some of it, so a lot of it related to my family in one way or another. New Orleans was a very natural choice because that's like the big city in Louisiana and just in the South. And, again, my mom having grown up in this small town, she would always tell me, I love going to New Orleans, but my mom is always like, she grew up with her mother saying like, don't go there. That's the big city. Like, I'm afraid of you going there. So my mom still has this kind of feeling of New Orleans as the big scary city. So that became like a really natural place of like, okay, obviously if I'm 16, that's where I want to go. If I'm growing up in this small town, like I am trying to run away to go there. So that became like a really natural choice of where the twins kind of escaped to. And there are parts there, like you said, there's parts that are in LA, and my dad is from LA. So that's my dad's side of the family is Californian. So that kind of felt like a natural way to kind of braid those sides of my family geographically. And then from there, I think when I'm thinking about location, I'm always thinking about places that can contrast with each other in interesting ways. So, if you have a character who's in LA, like where are you going to send them next? New York is an obvious choice, and that's where somebody ends up. But then also the Midwest, another character ends up in the Midwest. And I spent a few years in Michigan for grad school, but that California to Midwest shift is a really dramatic shift culturally and climate wise. So that felt like a natural foil to being in LA is now you're going to go to Minnesota. Here's a coat. Good luck. So sometimes there were moments like that just felt like nice ways to kind of jolt the narrative. But I think also kind of thematically it gave me a new way to explore the workings of race in these different locations, because I think sometimes, again, as a person who grew up in California, people, and now I live in New York, in these cities or states that are consider themselves to be more progressive, they often think that there's no race problem here, that the race problem is somewhere else. The race problem is in Louisiana. Now that we're in California, everything is okay. But for me, as in that section I just read, I wanted to think about things like homeowners associations, which were these legal ways and still are for people to enforce white supremacy within their neighborhoods. It's not the same as a lynch mob, but it is functioning in that same way of preventing this Black family from moving into this neighborhood. So I wanted to think about how those rules of race change in different parts of the country, and not that they go away, but they shape in the way that a lot of the characters in the book shape shift. Excuse me. So that was kind of my thinking about the geography. And as far as influences, I think there were a ton of influences for this book. I think about there were a lot of books like Nella Larsen's Passing and some of these iconic passing novels, a novel, but also a film that I saw, Imitation of Life, which I think is probably one of the most like canonical stories about passing. So that was one that was also something that I think influenced me as I was thinking about this book. And lots of other texts about complicated families and siblings. Danzy Senna's Caucasia was also really helpful, story about passing and sisterhood. So there were a lot of different things that I read that prepared me for this book.
You know what? There's also a lot about mothers and daughters in the book. You explore like Adele. I loved her and I want happiness for her. Like I feel like so if you're thinking, you know what, in your spare time, if you if the mood strikes you, just I wanted Adele to have like some happiness,
Yeah.
just so much. But then when that the idea of going home and not being able to return home, or not feeling welcome, or not being sure that you're going to be to be welcomed, that it was hard on, I think, on the mothers of the book, hard on the daughters. There was all this generational trauma that had just gone through this family. And I think you did such a wonderful job of giving us the mother and the mothers and the daughters and their relationships, but also kind of the rationale behind it. So we didn't have to like anyone's choices, or feel like, oh, I would have done this. I would. No, it was,
Mm-hmm.
this is the context under which these choices are made. And I don't know if it's because like I'm always thinking about mothering and about like momming. It's like my favorite verb. I'm always thinking about like momming and also home. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about just momming and how you explored mothering in the book through these characters and through their relationships, because I know it's really touching.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a theme that I'm also interested in when it comes to writing and reading. And I think there are lots of moments of this throughout the book. There are, like you said, these mother-daughter relationships that are both complicated, and from the twins and their mother, and then also when the twins become mothers and their relationship with their daughters, all that's really complicated. And then I think you'll have other figures, like as you were talking, I was thinking about, there's a character named Barry who is kind of a mother in the book. He takes in Jude when she comes to LA, and he, shows her, he's giving her advice, like relationship advice, and trying to kind of show her about life. And he was based on friends that I made when I went to grad school. I was like one of the youngest people in my year. So I remember making these friends who were slightly older than me, but had just more life experience than I did. And they were just like showing me the ropes of life. Like, this is what this is. So the relationship between those two is kind of based on that. But all these people in my life who have mothered me in some way, I thought about that as I was working on the book. So I wanted to think about the complexity of that, and yeah, to see these characters. I don't know. I think that there's something to me that's always compelling about people trying to take care of each other. That's always more interesting to me than watching people hurt each other. Although there's parts of that in this book too, but I think it's much more fascinating to watch people try to care for each other, even when they fall short in certain ways, and even when sometimes that leads to them hurting other people. But to see people make that effort and try to care for each other, I think is something that I'm always interested in exploring in some way in fiction.
You know what? So, like, thank you for that. I also have this thing. You know how people go to conferences or to things and they say, this is not a what do they say? I don't, this isn't a question, this is a statement. And
Yeah.
and I don't, in theory, because I'm about to do it, it's something that I like you usually would never do. And yet there's this line in the book and I just feel like I had to read it. And then I was like, do you have a question about it? And I was like, no, I just wanted to say thank you. So I'm going to do the air quotes. So she wanted him to believe anything but the truth, that she was young and bored, and she dragged her sister to a city where she'd lost herself. And I just felt like, wow. So because I feel like it happens to so many of us, we go to a new place and we lose ourselves, or we bring someone with us and they lose themselves. And so I know that like there should be this question in there, but as someone who has done that, who is like convinced someone to move to a new city like ages ago because of the books I was reading, I was like, oh, we have to move to Baltimore, everything's happening in Baltimore. And I feel like if my friend had asked, like, what makes you think that? I'm sure I would have been the person to say, like, everything I'm reading at this time is pointed there. But she didn't ask and I never said. But I just felt like it happens. We move somewhere and sometimes we lose sight of who we are. So just thank you so much for exploring that. And I guess just for acknowledging like that. So sadly, I didn't have a question around. But gosh, I just had to say thank you, because it just felt like, what, you saw us, like for those of us who have experienced that, I don't know, like I just felt like you saw us there. So thank you. But I do actually have a different question. So for me, I felt like it was an emotional read. It was still hopeful, and throughout it, you explored family history, legacies, trauma. And it's the trauma, the things that we hold on to, the things that we ignore, the people we hold on to, the people we ignore, also the people we let go, the pains that we inflict, that we endure and let go. There was identities, those that we inherit, embody, or we shake loose. And as a book, it's a gift that allows readers space and time to reflect on our own lives and the stories and events that make us who or how we are. And I was curious, what would you like readers to do, to think, to feel, to change after we've read this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough question, because I think for me, the biggest thing is that I just want people to enjoy the experience of reading it and having read it. I think that's the biggest thing. I never take for granted that anybody wants to read this book, because there are so many, I mean, so many amazing books that we all could be reading. As I have like this gigantic stack of books on my coffee table right now, I'm trying not to look at. So we all have so many things that we could be reading, and also other things that we could be and need to be doing. So the fact that anyone wants to take time to read this book, I hope that you enjoy the experience of reading it. But I think beyond that, I think that the biggest thing that I really took away from it is the idea that identity is really complicated, and that it's more complicated than language often allows it to be. And what does that mean then, especially for me as a writer, as a person who works in language and just a human who uses language? What does that mean for how I think about identity, or how I speak about identity, for how I think about my own identity or that of other people? I think that those are the things that I kept kind of running up against. And an example was, I realized I was trying to talk about Kennedy, who is Stella's her daughter. And like early on when the book first came out, I would be trying to talk about Kennedy, and I would start to kind of stumble over how I would identify her racially. And that was, and I'm still not completely sure what I would say. I heard somebody once describe her as, I think he said like functionally white with Black heritage. And that was probably the most accurate sort of description of her, but I wasn't sure, like, how do I describe the sort of white passing daughter of a white passing mother who has Black heritage, but her dad's white? All of that was so much more complicated than saying she's white, she's Black. And that's true of all of us, I think, to some extent. Who we are is so much more complicated than whatever the labels that are assigned to us. So how can I then, instead of reducing the identity to the language, how can we find ways to expand language that encompasses the complexity of our identities?
I think that's great. It's funny, when you were talking about that, I was thinking, I wonder how Kennedy would describe herself.
Yeah.
And I feel like, well, I feel like she would do it, or.
I think she kind of tries different ways, like throughout the book, like she kind of auditions these different ways of thinking and talking about herself, which I think we often all do in different ways. And I think that's also like a healthy and fine thing to do, that sometimes one label feels right and sometimes it no longer does, it no longer serves you, so you find another way to talk about yourself. But I think she's someone who that's always kind of a moving target for her, of how she, I have people ask me sometimes of like what I think the characters would be doing now. And for her in particular, I'm like, how would she identify racially now? Would that be different than how she identifies when you see her earlier in the book, like as time has gone by? And also our conversation about race has gotten more complicated. Maybe she would find other ways that, I don't know. I imagine that for her, that would always be kind of this moving target. But yeah, I think the complexity of that is something that I think that writing this book has made me see more than I ever had before, just as a person moving through the world. So now I try my best to afford myself that complexity, but also to, I think more importantly, afford that to other people, and to notice when I'm not doing that, when I'm trying to like rush to conclude something about somebody or rush to put somebody in some type of box. I think I become more aware with the fact that when I'm doing that, and I try to curb it more than I think before writing this book.
I think it's great because I feel like you've shown us that through the book, how identities can shift, and it can depend on context. It can depend on just so many different things, and to not judge people or make these assumptions that we might otherwise jump to. So thank you for the experience of the book. So I'm going to ask a question that, I have a PhD student, and she's interested in writing about these calendar customs. So the customs that we do in societies and communities, and how they might shift as far as community and relationships and characters, how they interact with them. And it's something that, until she started mentioning it, I didn't always notice it in books. And then I was like, okay, wait, so rereading The Vanishing Half, I'm like, there's Founders Day. So the community, they have this event that they come around, and it reinforces their relationship to the principles of the town, their commitment to it. And I'm curious about, what does Founders Day make possible for the book, for the characters, and what it kind of allows you to explore in the writing?
Yeah. I think, I don't remember at what point in the book that became like a holiday that I invented. But I was interested in, I think partly because of the relationship that the twins have both to this town and also to their family's role in creating this town. That this is not just like, oh, I grew up in this small town, I don't like being there, but it's also, this is, I can trace my lineage back to this place. Their family is tied into the foundation of this town, which begins in these really sort of painful and really painful origins of this place, and that's where they trace their family line to. So part of it for me is that just thinking about the weirdness of, I guess, imagining something like that, of there being a holiday that like goes back to something your ancestor, like your direct ancestor did. That being something that I think, especially as a teenager, I would be deeply embarrassed about and not want to partake. There was one way that I thought about with that, but also that's the moment where the twins decide to run away. Like that is the day where they kind of decide to actually break from the town on this day that's meant to like draw everybody back to the founding of the town. And that just felt like a nice kind of poetic note that this is the day that they are deciding to escape from this place, even though they are bonded to it by their bloodline. So I think it was a mixture of all those things. But I really, in the beginning of the book, I wanted to take some time to build up this town as kind of a character in the story. Because even though, as you said, you don't spend the whole book in Mallard, I think it's a type of place like you don't escape it. It follows you even when the characters are in LA or they're in New York or whatever. The town is always kind of following them wherever they go. So it was important for me from that beginning to really establish this town, and to create a holiday felt like a way to establish like the values of that town, and also the twins' direct connection and also rejection of the values and their connection to it.
You know what I find I really loved. I know for me when I try to go back and like so who was my grandmother's father's father, when I try to go back, I don't know what I expect to find. But so at one point I was thinking about like one, how fortunate they might be to be able to go back and to, their great 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 grandfather, but then also how you might not like what you find when you go
Yes.
back there. So I thought, you know what? Thank you, Britt, because
I mean, I think so. And I think that's also, it's part of how I think it's part of the kind of, I think that's part of the romance at the heart of American identity, or the myth of whatever that means. Like there's part of it is there's this romance to being able to kind of come out of nowhere, like to have no lineage, to have no past, to just create yourself out of thin air. I think that's something that is a very kind of romanticized American ideal in a sense. Because as you said, there can be a lot of pain from knowing your history. There are times that you don't want to go back and find out what you discover on the other side. But on the flip side, yeah, there is something very anomalous about the fact that these are Black girls who can trace their family line back that far. So all of that is complex in that way. But I think part of it is like, part of this to me is, thinking about ways in which we can try to shed history, which again is another very American thing to try to do. But you can try to shake history, it will not always allow you to shake it. And most times it doesn't allow you to shake it. And that's definitely what happens in the case of these two girls who tried to run away on the anniversary of the town being founded, and in turn are hounded by this town for the rest of their lives.
well, yeah, there is that. So there are some wonderful questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask those now. And just to remind anyone, if you haven't had a chance to, please pop your question in the Q&A, and we're going to try to go through as many as possible. So, Britt, Lisa would like to say, I really enjoyed the book. I hoped that the sisters would make amends and be close again. Lisa, you're not the only one. Um, Lisa would like to know, were you tempted to write that ending?
Well, thank you, Lisa, for reading. Honestly, no, there was no version of this book where they ended up kind of reuniting and becoming close to each other again. There were versions of the book where they never saw each other again. So the version that ended up in the, in the draft was actually, from my perspective, like, oh, this was like a nicer, this was a nicer version, because they do have a moment where they see each other again. But no, I mean, for me, that was never how I imagined it ending. I just felt like these are people, they have spent so much more of their lives apart than they ever did together. They have turned into these two completely different people as adults. And the idea that they would be able to return to where they were as children, that just never felt real to me. I knew from the beginning that I was writing a story about this family that splinters, and I didn't see it coming. We're all going to have a family reunion and like repair things. Like that to me just never felt emotionally honest. So I knew that I was writing about this fracture, but I think I did want to get them in a room again. I wanted to see what would happen if I could get them in a room again. But I just never imagined them kind of riding off to the sunset in that way.
Thank you. And there's another question. They say, can I ask why you featured Stella's story and left Desiree's story for us to imagine as she lived her life at the cafe back in Mallard? Did you find it more interesting to feature ostensibly the less likable and more complex twin? And Ella says, thank you.
I think part of it was, I think whenever I'm writing, I always want to write towards what is one, I think what is more mysterious. So yes, I think that Stella's life is kind of the mystery at the beginning of the book. You meet Desiree on the first page and you have no idea what happened to Stella and who she's become. So part of it was that sense that I knew that was the mystery that I was writing toward. So I knew that I wanted to go in that direction. But I think another part of it is that it became apparent to me that this book would be, it takes place over so much time, and the story kind of gets passed like a baton from character to character. So, the story gets passed from Desiree, then it goes to Jude, and then it goes from Jude to Stella, and then it goes from Stella to, it kind of moves along in that way. So I didn't want to completely abandon Desiree, but I knew that most of the action was going to be happening somewhere else. So it was mostly that, I think, of wanting to follow kind of that story getting passed along from these other characters and among these other characters as things go by. But I wanted to make sure that we saw Desiree again, and that she pops up, and we get to see her as she's kind of lived out her life in Mallard.
Oh, thank you. So another question says, I loved the characters of Jude and Reese and your portrayal of their relationship. Did you base them on anyone in particular?
No, no, those are just two characters that came from my imagination. But yeah, I began to think of their relationship as kind of the romantic heart of the book, and that was not something that I think I set out to do. Because I originally thought the book would just be about the twins. I didn't even think I was going to go into the next generation, let alone what their personal lives would be like. So I wasn't planning that, but I really loved the relationship. I think it's probably the healthiest relationship that I have ever written, and honestly, probably will ever write. So it was nice to have those moments, I think, of lightness and joy among, like, within a book that has a lot of other really intense moments and intense relationships. So it was good to see, I think, two people who love and respect each other and trust each other. And yeah, to see that, like I said, in a book where there are some really difficult and often toxic relationships.
Thank you. Another question. Was it coincidence or deliberate that Jude and Kennedy almost had the wrong mothers? Desiree would have encouraged Kennedy's acting so much more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was definitely deliberate. I loved the idea of them. I mean, for one, it creates a sense of tension within those relationships because yes, Stella would have loved to have a daughter who wanted to be a doctor, like it created some tension within those relationships because both women feel as if their daughters are kind of strangers to them. But not only that, it also creates a connection between those sisters, even though they are physically apart. Each has a daughter that in some way reminds her of her sister. So even if you don't see the sisters physically together during that part of the book, there is kind of a psychic, emotional connection through their relationships with their daughters. And it began to appear to me that, like, oh yeah, when Stella is arguing with Kennedy, she's kind of arguing with Desiree. It's not just about these mothers and daughters, it's also about those sisters too.
Oh, how lovely. Okay, Sally says, hi, Britt. It's so interesting to hear you talk about your excellent book. You refer to race, oh, sorry. It's so interesting to hear you talk about your excellent book. You refer to racial passing. As an English person, I'm not familiar with this term. Could you explain it, please?
Yeah, I mean, uh, I would say that racial passing is deciding to live as a member of a different race. So yeah, I mean, there's a pretty long history of racial passing in American literature, certainly. But I think there are lots of different stories about passing in general. You know, like I'm watching Mad Men right now, and I'm like, yeah, this is a story about passing. It's a white guy who's passing, but he's passing, you know, he's passing for a different white guy, but he's still passing. So, or something like The Great Gatsby, which is also a passing story. So I think there are a lot of narratives about passing, of people living as one thing or a different thing or transforming into something else. But what I'm, yeah, most specifically referring to is somebody living as a different race, which is, you know, something that's very deeply embedded into American literature, certainly, but something that I wanted to tackle in a way that was a bit more contemporary, hopefully.
Great, thank you. Jasper would like to know, did any characters from The Vanishing Half continue to live with you after you finished writing the book?
You know, I don't think so. I think that it's been a weird I think it's been like a weird process for this book, because I think usually, like, once I've finished a book, I'm usually kind of ready to emotionally move on and say goodbye to the characters. But the experience of The Vanishing Half, you know, this book came out a year ago, and I'm still talking about this book, doing events about this book and talking to people about it, and will continue to do so probably well into next year. So there's a way that they live with you because you're thinking about them, because you're talking about them in a way that probably would not be the case if I was no longer talking about this book. But there also is a way that I don't think I have the type of, it begins to feel like you're talking about somebody else. Like, it doesn't feel in the way that, like, what I'm working on right now, it's like, oh, that feels so it feels so intimate, it feels so close to you. Once you, I think, have, you know, once the book has come out, once people have started reading and engaging with the characters, it begins to feel like something outside of you and something separate from you, which I think is healthy and good, to be honest, because it would be really brutal to hear people, you know, tell you that they don't like your book or whatever their reading of it is, if you felt like it was too close to you. So I think it's good to have a little bit of detachment, but I think, yeah, I think the experience for this book has been so different than my first book, because the reception to this book has just been out of this world. And as a result, I'm still talking to people about this book like every day. So still, I think they live with me in a sense, but also they have begun to feel like sort of separate beings apart from me, in a way that I think is actually good.
It does sound psychologically healthy. So
Yes, I think so.
Rhiannon says, absolutely loved the book. Which character was your favorite to write? And who did you relate to the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are two different answers. I think the characters that I related to the most was probably Jude and Stella. I think those are kind of my introverts, and those are people who are both pretty ambitious and also kind of restless. I think those are traits that I share. Um, as far as who I enjoyed writing, I really had a lot of fun writing the men in the book. I loved writing Early. I loved writing Barry, who I mentioned earlier, who was really fun. I loved writing Reese. Like, I had a lot of fun with these guys in the book, and I didn't think that the book was going to really focus on them, because I thought the book would just be about the twin sisters. And then I said, okay, well, maybe them and their daughters, but that's it. But then there were these other characters who just kind of, you know, grabbed my attention. And I was like, yeah, I want to have a section from, you know, Early. I want to have a section from Reese. Like, I began to become even like a little bit of Blake's, Stella's husband, that I read a little bit from his point of view. There were these men who kind of made their way into the book, and also became really interesting to kind of see their perspective, even though they are kind of marginal characters
You know, and it's, I'm not going to jump down, but that does tie into someone else asks a question about the male characters, but I'm going to do them in order because
in a way. Okay.
I know sometimes, like, when you ask a question early and then you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't get to answer my question.
Mhm.
So we're not going to do that. So the next question, each character, see, we love these characters, Britt, you just cannot get away from them. So each character is so richly drawn. I wanted to know more. Have you any desire to follow any of the other characters' stories further?
Probably not at this time, but yeah, I've been asked about this a bit. And I think if I did, it would probably be the cousins and see them in the next generation and what, I think that question of like what they would be doing now is like a fun thought experiment because yeah, they would be like, middle-aged women now probably. So that would be kind of interesting, but I don't think so. I don't know that I ever have it in me to write a follow-up to anything. I think I've always been kind of like, once it's done, it's done. I want to move on. I want to write something that's going to be completely different than the thing I did before. That's always kind of my feeling. But I'll never say never. We'll see what life has in store.
I would love to see a happy ending for Adele. I'm just saying it would be completely different, something you've never done before.
That's
And just putting it out there. So here's another question. Hi, Britt. Thanks for such a wonderful book. Do you think Stella ever wished that she had never left or never created the lies she had to live with? I felt a sense of regret from her, especially during her relationship with Loretta.
Yeah, I think, for me, I'm always interested. I think this is true of my first book too. I'm interested in characters who, particularly women, who make these choices that they have complicated feelings about, but also like I think there's something about Stella that I think maybe she regrets it. Maybe part of her does, but I think there's also, to me, a big part of Stella's arc was her having to just own the fact that this is the choice that she made because she wanted to make that choice. I
Mm.
think she makes a lot of excuses in the beginning of, oh, well, it was my husband and it was the fact that I had a kid and that kind of like trapped me into the story I told. And she tells herself all of that because that's kind of a gentler way of thinking about your life, but it's also a really passive way of thinking about your life. And eventually she has to realize, no, like I chose all of this. Like I made these choices. However I feel about them, they're my choices. And to me, like that is, I think, always the biggest thing for me. I care less about whether a character feels good or bad about a decision and more about the fact that this is the decision that they were able to make and that they chose to make. So I think that there's probably part of her that regrets it, but I think there's also another part of her that like the alternative in her mind was probably being and living out her whole life in Mallard like her sister does, and I don't know that that's what she wants to do either. So I think that she regrets it probably in the sense that she loses that relationship with her family, but as far as I don't think that she regrets the fact that she ends up with a lot of money and privilege and power. Like I don't think she regrets that at all.
Good point. Good point. Sarika has a craft question. So first, thank you for your wonderful book. I found the prose really vivid and distinctive. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the literary dimensions of your creative process, how you balance telling the story clearly and telling it in words that also have a style that conveys meaning.
Yeah, I think a lot of that just comes through revision and editing and all of the drafts, and also my editor and the people who've given me feedback on it. I think my impulse as a writer is that I always want to be clear. I don't like writing that obscures itself. Like I personally don't enjoy it. And that's not to say that it's simplistic or flat or anything like that. But I like writing that is clear. And also writing that's beautiful. I think those are the things that I'm looking for when I'm reading. So a lot of that comes from, I think, revision of, I try not to focus too hard on each individual sentence in the beginning because I know that so much of the book will change. So I'm not going to try to write a perfect sentence when I might end up cutting that whole chapter. So I try not to get too precious about each detail in the very beginning. But as time goes by, then I'm always thinking about, is there a more precise way to say this? Is there a more like distinct or interesting way to say this? I think a lot of revision for me is cutting things or condensing things. Sometimes you'll do a thing. I had a writing professor who called it multiple choice writing because you have like 3 adjectives in the sentence and they all mean the same thing, but you just have 3 of them. So, in that case, then it's like, okay, which of these adjectives is the right one, is the more interesting one, is the clearer one, instead of having 3 things that you're saying. So there are different things like that I do as I go through editing to try to make the language clearer. But I think that to me is the big thing. I want to write a sentence that is clear, but also beautiful, and also sounds good to the ear. I read the book towards the very end. I read the entire book out loud, and that's when you really hear, oh my God, I repeat that word over and over again, or you'll hear things like that your eye misses when you're just reading it. So that's like a kind of a long drawn out process of it for me, but it's just a lot of drafts and just trying to get better in each draft.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to race through these last 3
Okay.
questions. So Isabella would like to say, really liked Reese and Jude's relationship. Do you see them having a future together?
Yes, I do.
Awesome.
I always envisioned that.
Next question, anonymous attendee, really loved the male characters. Would you like to see it made into a film? They think it would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's going to be adapted for a limited series for TV. So I'm looking forward to that. And hopefully that, we're still in the early process with it, but I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome. The last question we have time for. The plot is driven forward by a significant coincidence, and the novel contains some reflections on the relationship between the improbable and the impossible. Were you interested in coincidences and the improbable before writing this novel, or was it something that emerged as the best way to develop the plot in these characters?
I think it emerged as like a natural way to deal with this particular sort of type of story. I think that's kind of the nature of, I think, often stories of passing, of having these moments of missed connections and forced revelations. Like those are kind of tropes of melodrama and these forms that are also like within the book. So I think a lot of it was that, and realizing that I wasn't writing a strictly realist book. I knew that I was not writing a book that existed in this like that kind of mode. I knew I was always writing a book that was kind of off kilter in some way, so that these types of coincidences were plausible within that creative mode.
Oh, thank you so much for your generosity, Britt, for
Sure.
reading to us. This has been such a lovely event. Can I also say thank you to the independent bookshops across the UK for supporting this event. And of course, again, thank you to everyone who joined us this evening, for watching, for buying The Vanishing Half. This has been such a joy and such an honor to talk to you. And for everyone who sent in questions, your questions were wonderful. And thank you for sending in questions. So thank you, everyone, and a wonderful rest of your day or evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.